In this video, I'm going to show you the mute button mixing trick, and this technique is a great way to identify where the issues are in your mix. So if you want to clean up your mixes and remove that muddiness and that harshness, and also make sure different instruments aren't clashing with each other, keep watching. But first, be sure to download our free EQ cheat sheet because EQ is a big part of making this mixing trick work. So I want to make sure you have everything you need to do the EQ part of this technique, and that cheat sheet is going to guide you through the EQ part of this process. So there's a link in the description or on screen now. Hey, Rob here from Musician on a Mission. Now, this is a trick that I actually learned from Jason Moss, who I think in turn learned from Bob Power. So I can't take credit for this at all, but it's a really helpful technique that I want to share with you today. We're actually going to cover 3 different applications: removing mud, removing harshness, and then also preventing frequency masking. So this is just a great technique for figuring out which channels are causing those issues. So if you're listening to your whole mix and you're doing the right thing by not using the solo button, you're trying to mix with everything in context, and you can hear that the mix is sounding muddy or sounding harsh, but you're not exactly sure why. That's where this is going to come into it. So let's start by having a listen to this track. I would not say that everything's fine. Okay, so one issue that I've already identified with this, and I'll compare the references in a second for you to hear it too, is that there's quite a lot of muddiness in kind of the 170 area. Normally muddiness tends to sit around 200 to 500, but sometimes it can sit a bit lower, and here we're kind of sitting just below 200, and I'm going to show you how that sounds in a second. But first, let's compare to a couple of references so you can just kind of tune your ears. I would not say working to the boss life on the board. Well, they probably should have known, but they don't. So compared to this track, which is a lot more modern, we have kind of too much mid-range. This track sounds really scooped. We're more similar to this track, which has kind of like an older sound to it. I actually think we're kind of doing better than that already. But the issue is I want this to sound a bit more modern, so I want to try and sort out this mid-range a little bit. And a lot of what I'm hearing is this kind of muddiness, and I can confirm that by kind of moving this around a bit and finding where the issue is. I would not say that everything's fine. So that's kind of what I'm hearing. There's a lot of power down there. You can hear it when I boost it. Now we can always do a kind of preliminary check to see if this is the right kind of frequency area by doing a cut here and seeing if that cleans it up. I would not say that everything's fine. That's just life on. So that is cleaning it up a bit. We're a bit closer to one of our reference tracks now. But this is a really drastic way of fixing this issue. When you identify these problems that are kind of prevalent in the whole mix, it's tempting to just, add a cut on the mix bus, and it seems like we've solved it. But what we're doing here is actually removing some good frequencies from everything else where it might not be an issue. So maybe there's 1 or 2 instruments where they're adding to this build-up of frequencies around 175, and then other instruments, say for example the drums and the acoustic guitar, they actually have some really nice sounding stuff around this frequency area. But by just applying a cut to the mix bus, we're removing that stuff as well. So we're better off figuring out, okay, well, what is the instrument that's actually causing this issue? And that's really the key to the mute button trick, because what we're going to do now is just go through and start by muting our different group channels until we notice that the problem kind of disappears or at least becomes worse. I would not. So in this case, I actually think there's a few instrument groups that are contributing to the issue. But most of all, it's the electric guitar. And the reason why I think there's a lot of build-up, and this is often the cause of muddiness, is that you have a lot of instruments that are centered around the same frequency ranges in terms of their fundamental notes. So we've got quite a low male vocal that's going to be getting close to 200 or sitting around there. The bass guitar is always going to have quite a lot of energy around 200. These electric guitars, though, I think are the main issue. And when I muted the electric guitars, it seemed like the whole mix kind of opened up and sounded a bit cleaner and more transparent. So let's have a listen to that again. I'll mute this.
I would not say that everything's fine. That's just life on the borderline.
So then we could go a level deeper and see if it's one particular guitar by muting now the individual channels instead of just on the group bus.
I would not say that everything's fine.
But in this case, I'm pretty sure it's both, because we have kind of like the same part played twice and then panned left and panned right. Having said that, though, they do have quite a different tone. And let's try that again, because it seems like this left guitar might be contributing more.
I would not say that everything's fine. That's just life on the borderline.
So that definitely helps. It's this guitar more so than anything else. So we've narrowed it down by starting on the group channels, muting until we kind of find, okay, which instrument group is it? Then we go to the individual channels. Okay, is it all of them or is it one specific channel? And now instead of applying quite a brutal EQ on the whole mix, we can just go to this one channel where we've identified the issue and do our cut there. So then we just go here and we cut the area that we found to be the issue. And we can test it again just by boosting it.
I would not say that everything's fine.
So I'll solo this just so you can hear what's going on. So this is without the cut. And then with. So that's definitely helped, but there are other instruments here where it's still an issue. So I'm just going to quickly add some cuts to the bass and the male vocals until we've addressed that kind of muddiness on all of the channels individually by varying degrees, depending on how much of an issue is, now that we've identified which channels are contributing to that muddiness.
I would not say that everything's fine.
So I don't really think it's much of an issue on the vocal. We can actually see on the frequency spectrum here that it's sitting a bit higher.
I would not say that everything's fine.
So I think by cleaning it up on the guitars and the bass, we've addressed that issue. We might then want to do a tiny bit more on the mix bus once we fix the individual channels. If it's still a bit of an issue across the board, we can still add a subtle cut or boost, depending on what you're trying to do on the mix bus itself. We just don't want to be too brutal on the mix bus, and that's the key here because it can do weird things to the mix.
I would not say that everything's fine. Won't you work a little bit more magic? That's just life on the borderline.
So that's sounding much cleaner now. So that's the process in general, and you can apply this to different issues in the mix. So not just muddiness, pretty much anything. If you're listening to the whole mix, comparing to references, and you kind of notice an issue, but you're not quite sure what's causing that issue, instead of going through and soloing the channels, which doesn't really work because it's about how everything combines, not how everything sounds in solo. And maybe this issue doesn't exist when you just solo the guitar, it sounds fine on its own, but then when you combine several guitars, now it's really muddy. As you just saw, we combine that left guitar and the bass, and together it sounds muddy. Separately, they sounded pretty good. So we can't use the solo button. Instead, we have to go through, mute the group channels until we find the instrument group that's guilty, and then go and find the individual channel that's the most guilty. And then after that, we can do kind of broader cuts on the mix bus, stuff like that. So you can apply this to any problem, but I find myself using this a lot for muddiness, also harshness, which I'm going to show you now. And we can also do a very similar thing to find areas where we're getting frequency masking, where certain channels, let's say a guitar is masking other channels like the vocal, and they're clashing. They've got lots of the same frequencies, so they're kind of fighting each other for the same space. We can use this same trick to figure out, okay, what's getting in the way of the vocal. But first, let's try harshness, because I do think there's a bit of harshness here that I identified before this video, just to make this a bit quicker. So I'm going to show you how this sounds.
I would not say that everything.
And we can kind of hear already and get a rough idea of what the guilty instrument is, because when we solo it, if you have an EQ that can do this and you can solo the frequency band, I can hear one instrument more than the rest. Also, when you boost, you should hear that one instrument comes out more than everything else.
I would not say that everything's fine.
So to me, the acoustic guitar is really popping out there. But let's double check that. So now we're going to go through and figure out where the issue is by muting the different channels.
I would not say that that's just life on the borderline. I would not say that everything's fine.
So I skipped the bass there because it's highly unlikely the bass is going to be adding harshness. To me, it's obvious. It's the acoustic guitar. As soon as we mute that channel, we lose a lot of the upper mid-range content. So much so that we don't want to get rid of it completely, because now the mix does actually sound, again, more open, more transparent, but also it's kind of missing something in that upper mid-range. So of course, we're not just going to mute the acoustic guitar, and we want to be careful we don't remove too much, but that's clearly the issue. We can start by just turning it down a bit, because it might not even need EQ. It might be that the acoustic guitar is just a bit too loud in the mix. So instead of EQing it, we can just turn it down, and then the overall frequency balance of the mix is going to improve, because we take this harsh instrument that's adding kind of upper mid-range harshness, and we just turn it down, and now it's more balanced out. But we might then also need EQ. So I think it was up here somewhere, and that's really annoying. Let's get rid of that.
I would not say that everything. I would not say that everything's fine.
It's still poking out a bit every now and then on the harder strums. That could be an issue that we look to a compressor for. We could check this compressor here to make sure it's catching those.
I would not say that everything's fine.
So this is actually a sidechain compressor where we're dropping the acoustic guitar to the lead vocal. So in that case, we do need some compression on the acoustic guitar itself. So again, this isn't just an EQ thing. And I think I already have some compression here. Let's check it's that one.
Would not say everything's fine.
So now let's just check that this compressor is catching those louder notes, because it's only every now and then when they hit it harder that I'm hearing that harshness kind of poke through the mix.
I would not say that everything's fine. That's just life on the borderline.
So that's better. That's definitely better. We have dropped the acoustic guitar in the mix. So to bring that harshness down, we brought down the volume of the acoustic. But then you might think, well, now you can't hear the acoustic guitar as much, or you want that thing to be louder. So then you could leave it at the same volume and just using EQ instead.
I would not say that everything's fine. That's
So there you go. That also fixed the problem, just a different way of going about it. Now the acoustic guitar is still kind of louder in the mix. We've still got the fullness of that acoustic, but without as much harshness. So multiple ways to address it, but the first thing is just go through, mute those channels until you find the issue. And then one more thing, I feel like the lead vocal isn't sticking out enough. Again, we could address that by just turning it up a bit, but quite often in the mix, there will be an instrument or a channel that is clashing with the lead vocal and fighting for the same space. And by getting that thing out of the way a bit, you can create more space for the lead vocal and make sure that's front and center at all times. Now, I've already done that a bit with this acoustic guitar. I just showed you this is a sidechain compressor, so it's sidechain to the vocal and I'm dipping the acoustic guitar. So let's go through now and just mute these and figure out what's clashing and see if it is that guitar and if we've already fixed that problem.
I would not say that everything's fine. I would not say. I would not say that everything's fine. I would not say. I would not say that everything's fine.
So I definitely think it's the guitars. It's the acoustic guitar, but also the electric guitars I think are getting in the way a bit. So besides the fact we already have a bit of sidechain compression on the acoustic guitar, we could also figure out where it's competing with the lead vocal. Now that we've used that mute button trick to figure out that, okay, it's the acoustic guitars and probably electric guitars as well, I can do like a cut sweep like this. And as soon as I notice the vocal suddenly has a lot more space, that's the point at which we've kind of identified, okay, so that's the area where it's masking the same frequencies as the vocal.
I would not say that everything's fine. I would not say. I would not say that everything's fine.
And let's just loop something where the vocal is in so that we don't have to keep.
That's just life on the borderline. That's just life on the borderline. That's just life on the border.
And if you want, you could solo just to find the issue and then go back to having the whole mix to then decide how much you're going to cut by.
That's just life on the border. That's just life on the border. That's just life on the borderline. That's just life on the borderline. That's just life on the. That's just life on the borderline. That's just life on the borderline. That's just life on the borderline.
So I can't find one particular area where it's a really obvious kind of opening up. Instead, I think it's just kind of across the board. So we could just tweak that sidechain compressor a bit. I think it does help to have a bit of a cut here at 1,000.
That's just life on. That's just life on. That's just life on.
So then we can do the same with the electric guitars because they were definitely getting in the way as well.
That's just life on the borderline. 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 That's just life on the borderline.
So similar thing, it's kind of getting in the way at 1K, but I also find that it's getting in the way a bit here at around 200.
That's just life on the borderline. That's just life on the border. That's just life on the borderline. That's just life on the borderline. I would not say that everything's.
So there we go. That's definitely better. We've created a bit more of a pocket for the vocal now, and We just had to identify which instruments, which channels were competing with the mute button technique. So that's it. It's pretty simple. You can use it to identify any issue in your mix and then figure out which channel is guilty for adding that issue. So as you saw here, a big part of this is EQ. There are other ways to go about it. We covered sidechain compression very briefly, but also volume balancing. But as you can see, EQ is normally the way that you would then go about fixing that issue on the individual channels. So to make sure you're kind of confident with EQ and you can go and do this process yourself, I put together a free EQ cheat sheet. This is actually one of our most popular cheat sheets. It's going to guide you through the EQ process for doing this when you're kind of surgically removing stuff, but also on the whole, just how do you EQ your mix? It's going to take you through that process. So it's completely free. There's a link in the description or on screen now, and then you can just reference that next time you're mixing to guide you through the EQ process. So that's all from me. I'll see you again next time. And remember, create regardless.